developed an informal competition as to who could deliver the longest, most exaggerated, often most fanciful and fantastic introduction. And I have to tell you that I responded very badly. Instead of recognizing calmly and skeptically what was happening, I started to believe all these things. I had notes I used to pass to the introducer because he forgot to mention an honor I received in high school. So by the time I got to the last stop, which was the Stamford, Connecticut Irish American Society, my head was so big and filled with my self-importance that I could just barely squeeze in the entry to the building. When I walked in, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, very excited, almost knocked me over, shook my hand vigorously, and said over and over again, "I'm so thrilled to meet you. You're a great man. I admire what you've done." She said, "I admire you so much that I drove 3.5 hours to come here. I don't live anywhere near here," she said, "just to shake your hand and to ask you, please, to sign my poster." And with that, she handed me a political poster with a big photograph on it and a pen. And I looked at it. I said, "I'm happy to sign your poster, but before I do, I think there's something I must tell you." She said, "What is it?" I said, "I'm not Henry Kissinger." It was a poster of Henry Kissinger.
Oh, God.
She said, "You're not?" She said, "Well, who are you anyway?" When I told her, she was terribly disappointed. She said, "That's awful." She said, "I drove 3.5 hours to shake Henry Kissinger's hand and to get his autograph, and all I've got is you." I said, "Well, I'm sorry you feel so bad." I said, "I wish there was something I could do to ease your pain." She thought for a minute. She said, "Well, there is." I said, "What is it?" And she leaned forward, put her face right up against mine, and in a conspiratorial whisper said, "Nobody will ever know the difference." She said, "Would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster?" So I did. Today in Eastern Connecticut, there's a big poster of Henry Kissinger hanging on the wall somewhere. Here's the best part. A few months ago, Henry and I appeared jointly at an event in New York, just like this one, with a moderator and the two of us, and talking about world issues. And I thought it'd be a good place to tell this story. So I did, and the crowd loved it, and Henry liked it. Then we went on with the program. Afterward, we left and were going down the elevator together. And he said to me, "You know," he said, "I've appeared with you several times. I've heard you give many speeches. That's the best I've ever heard you speak. All the times I've heard you." I said, "Really?" I said, "What especially impressed you?" He said, "It'd be pretty hard to top that introduction." He said, "I think you should tell that story all over America." So I'm in the process of doing so, and now I can check Nashville off on my box in my report to him. But seriously, it is very nice to be here. As I said, this is a great institution, and of course, to be interviewed by such a distinguished author, someone who I've long admired, and I hope not too tough on the questions. I'm buttering him up now. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, Henry.
All right.
So can you do the accents?
I don't do accents. That gets you in trouble when you do accents.
Great. Well, since this is an occasion where we're anticipating the president's trip, and the original evening was going to be a discussion between you and Ehud Barak, I thought we should probably start there.
Yes.
It seems kind of a paradox, this trip. On one hand, I just read a column by Thomas Friedman saying he can't remember a less anticipated trip to Israel. On the other hand, you have so many issues right on the precipice, perhaps less so the actual situation involving Israel and the Palestinians at this moment in terms of violence, but not in terms of its long-term effect. And then you have Syria and the issues there, and Iran, all of which will be discussed. What do you anticipate the president to be taking with him to Israel, and how will he handle it?
Well, I think there's a benefit in having low expectations. I benefited from it. When I got back after 2.5 years there, my wife said to me, "Well," she said, "the expectations for you were 0, and you met them." Well, it wasn't so bad if people don't expect anything, and I think very little is expected now, but with good cause. I think it's difficult to be optimistic in the short term with respect to the prospect for an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. And it's very important to do as you did, which is to set it in the broader context of the region. No issue, no significant conflict occurs in isolation of other factors. And what is, I think, unique about the Middle East is the many and the complexity of the factors that interact with Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At the same time, having spent some time in the Balkans and many years in Northern Ireland and 2 stints in the Middle East, I still remain firmly convinced that there's no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. Conflicts inevitably end. And the question and challenge is how to hasten the end and how to establish a context in which it can be an ending that promotes peace, promotes stability, and for Israel, promotes normalcy in the region, which has not and does not exist. And I think that ultimately, and I don't mean in the immediate future, but I think in the fairly reasonable foreseeable future, both sides will recognize that it is in their self-interest to reconcile their disagreements. That while it will be extremely painful on both sides, because both sides are deeply divided on the issue, the pain that will endure from not getting agreement will be far greater. There is a lull now which tends to create a sense of normalcy that simply doesn't exist. And I think both the Israelis and Palestinians face very severe challenges, serious threats, in part because of the other factors in the region, if they don't reach an agreement. Now, I'd be glad to get into that if you'd like. That takes a little while to get into the detail in terms of what I think of both, but in terms of the president's visit, I don't think he's carrying with him a new plan. You have a brand new government in Israel which just took office within days. It will take time to sort out the relationships there. In the cabinet of the government of Israel are ministers who believe in and have committed to work for a 2-state solution, and there are ministers who are publicly opposed to and are committed to work against a 2-state solution. How that is reconciled, how authority is exercised and distributed, all that remains to be seen. So I think the president very wisely isn't going there and pressing now. I think it's to express an interest, to convey what I hope will be a sense of hope, not a resignation to inevitability of conflict, but I think a desire for an inevitability of peace and reconciliation, and then subsequent to establishing that, hopefully conditions can be established to make it more likely that the parties can get into and reach agreement in negotiations.
You know, life is in the eyes of the beholder, and that seems especially true in the Middle East, where both sides have such deep narrative histories that sort of shape their perspectives. And as a writer of history and of narratives, that I honor that, but I also was sort of jolted a few weeks ago into thinking in a different way a little bit when 2 men came to the campus, one an Arab and one an Israeli, trying to talk about the peace process. And they both essentially said that you cannot relive the past. You have to get past the past, that those narratives can never be changed. You can't try to change them. You have to start fresh. It seems an impossibility, but is that part of the process that you dealt with both in the Middle East and in Northern Ireland in terms of trying to overcome the past and the deep ways?
A huge part of the problem. Interestingly, when I first went to Northern Ireland, it was shortly after I had read a series in the New York Times devoted to what it described as the lack of knowledge of Americans about their history. And I thought, what a terrible thing. We really should know more about their history. Then I went to Northern Ireland, and I found knowing too much about your history isn't particularly helpful either, especially sort of when history dominates the present and the future. And in fact, I think one of the reasons for the great success of American society has been largely a new, young, forward-looking society, ever refreshed by people coming here, attracted by American ideals and principles and the promise of the American dream, who have deliberately come seeking to avoid a return to the past. They're not interested in their past. That's why they left. And I think it is a burden. And it's hard to ask people in societies like that. And the other factor which the history contributes to in terms of burden is a profound and abiding sense of victimization on all sides. That was very deep in Northern Ireland, one of the most difficult hurdles to overcome, and it's even deeper in the Middle East. Both societies have very deeply held feelings of having been victimized by others. And when you have a deep sense of victimization, it enables you to overcome the restraints or inhibitions on actions that you might not otherwise take. It permits you to rationalize and justify doing things that in a different setting, or someone else were doing it in an external circumstance, you might not like. When President Clinton first came to Northern Ireland on his first trip, I arranged meetings with him, with the political leaders there. And I'll never forget this, and the president never will. It was late at night. He'd flown overnight to London, had spoke before the Parliament, got to Northern Ireland very late. He was extremely tired. I was traveling with him. I could hardly keep my eyes open. And we met first with Ian Paisley, who is the head of what is the largest unionist, principally Protestant party of Northern Ireland. And the president said hello, and Paisley launched into a 30-minute monologue, literally 30 minutes, that was the length of the meeting, on the history of Northern Ireland as seen from the unionist point of view. He was a powerful speaker, large with a booming voice, a dynamic public orator. And it was a compelling narrative. And he left. And in came Gerry Adams, representing the nationalist parties, principally Catholic. The president said hello, and he launched into a 30-minute narrative of the history of Northern Ireland seen from the nationalist side. And it was like one was speaking in Chinese and the other was speaking in Russian. They were two completely different stories. There was not a single acknowledgement on either side of an event that had been perpetrated by his side against the others. In other words, each was a litany of the historic victim events that afflicted their society with no recognition that there had been reciprocal actions the other way. And so all the president said that night were 4 words: hello, goodbye, which was good.
Clinton?
Yeah, we were all.
That's a record.
That's true. We were all tired, but it demonstrated and does demonstrate the depth of these feelings and the difficulty of getting people to look to the future and not to dwell on the past. And that was over and over again a major factor in Northern Ireland, and one of the last stumbling blocks to getting the agreement were factors that related to the past.
Well, let's stay in Northern Ireland for a second. You talked earlier this afternoon to some of my students about your first day in Belfast. That sounded fascinating.
Yeah. Most of these conflicts, the Balkans, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, others, we tend to identify as conflicts based on religious differences, sometimes ethnic differences, sometimes not, differences in national identity, and territorial disputes. What is not often recognized is that underlying all of them and critical to their failure and success are economic factors. I was taken on my very first day in Northern Ireland, I had never been there before, to what is ironically called the Peace Line. There may be some of you who have been to Belfast. It's a very large wall that goes right through the middle of the capital and largest city. Literally right across streets, right through some buildings. And it divides Catholics from Protestants. In the morning, I met with the Catholics on their side, nationalists. In the afternoon, with the Unionists, Protestants. While there were differences, there were many similarities, and they were brought vividly to mind by a Protestant minister, one of the most brilliant orators I've ever met, who came in and with a compelling tale. They're great talkers in Northern Ireland. I told them these guys could fill up the U.S. Senate many times over. He had two maps. The first was a map of violence in the urban areas of Northern Ireland. And then he overlaid it with a map unemployment in the urban areas of Northern Ireland. And you won't be surprised to know that they were very similar. And what he said to me was that in some of those urban areas, a large percentage of the young adult men, who he described as the most violent animal on earth, young adult men, were unemployed, had never held a job, and had never had the prospect of a job, and had a total lack of self-esteem, couldn't look their kids in the eye. And so people come along and said, I'll give you $200 a week and a gun, and you'll control your street or your block. And it offered them something they had never had. And the minister was making a point. He said, you can come here all you want. He said, you can get anybody to agree to anything. He said, but unless you can do something and lay the foundation for opportunity, for jobs, for income, so that men and women can have self-respect, it's the self-esteem that comes with being able to support your kids and being able to be a part of a community, this conflict will never end. And it stuck in my mind, and it's really true everywhere. It's not the triggering factor. It's not the only factor, but it is a major factor in resolving every one of these conflicts. And we devoted a lot of time in Northern Ireland, and I still devote a lot of time. I spoke at Ireland Day in the New York Stock Exchange just on Friday to promote investment there. People say to me all the time, oh, it's great, you're a great peace ambassador. Every person in this room, every person in this country can be a peace ambassador if you participate in trade, exchanges, do something that encourages economic growth. And of course, it's just as true in our country as anywhere. We're not immune from any of this. We need to do the same thing for our young men and women. And that's an important factor to keep in mind when you deal with any conflict anywhere.
Northern Ireland was, I think you would say, a great success in terms of the resolution of the conflict. If you can or are willing to, could you take us sort of inside the room, what it's like in private, what you dealt with? I understand that you were sort of a free agent in the sense you weren't even representing the United States.
That's right.
Is that true? And what did you have to overcome inside that room?
Well, I'll explain to you the opening day. The prime ministers of Britain and Ireland asked me to serve as chairman. And most of the political parties of Northern Ireland, there were 10 of them, agreed. A couple did not. And so there occurred a spirited debate lasting 3 days over my qualifications for the position, or in the words of the opponents, the absence of my qualifications for the position. And I had the unusual opportunity to sit in a room across the hall where the British government organized a piped-in thing, so I heard my fitness debated for 3 days by these guys. And finally, when they couldn't resolve it, the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland came in at 1:30 in the morning, and he said, we're going in. I said, sounds like an invasion of foreign territory. So we walked in, and there was this chaotic scene, a long rectangular table, about 60 people there, 10 parties, 2 governments, and me, and 1 seat assigned to the chairman. And someone was sitting in the chair. I walked over to it. It was a British security official. And he said, I'm sitting here because if I don't, I'm afraid they'll come take the chair and then we'll have to arrest them. There'll be a big hassle. He said, so when I get up, you sit right down. So he jumped up and I sat right down. And the two parties were literally get up and started chanting very, very loudly. No, 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 no. This went on for minutes and then they left. They walked out. That was my greeting at 1:30 in the morning. So I figured I got to do something here. I met for a little while and then I adjourned till 11 o'clock that same morning, and I left and I called the two political leaders up who had walked out, the two parties. And I said, look, I'm here. I'm going to stay. You made your point. Everybody knows you're against me, but it's in your interest to come back. I said, otherwise we might transact business that you won't like and you might prevent. So sure enough, they came back at 11 o'clock the next day. And in the end, we got pretty friendly, so much so that whenever they were going to hold a press conference denouncing me or demanding that I leave and get back to the United States, they'd come by my office and tell me, nothing personal, Senator. But we're going out and have this press conference. So by the end, we get along pretty well. That's one of the benefits of having it last so many years. Eventually, you get to know all these guys, and we ended up pals now. Whenever I go to Northern Ireland now, it's like I got Velcro on.
How much difference is there between what is said in the privacy of that room and what the players in the negotiations on the different sides have to say to their own publics when they leave the room? And how do you deal with that conflict?
It is a very important and very difficult issue. It is fundamental to our concept of democracy that we have freedom of the press. It is fundamental that the public know what's going on. And yet, if you tried to do a peace negotiation like that fully in public, that is, you invited the public in, you couldn't get to first base anywhere because they have constituencies, and if you make an offer on a single issue that hasn't been accepted, you run the risk of criticism from people on your side. Surrender, cave in, lack of principle, so forth and so on. The only way we were able to succeed is years later, I drafted the peace agreement. And I very much had in mind, I got to put something in here for everyone. I was a politician. These guys are all politicians. They got to go sell this to their constituency. And I would point out to them, here, you get A, B, C. Now, of course, I got to give them D, E, and F, but you can go out and say you get it. But when you're dealing with one issue at a time, you can't do it. And we had a press gauntlet. We were in a British government building, surrounded by a fence and protected by army and everything, but there was a gate. And right outside the gate, there was literally a press encampment. And every day, these delegates would walk in and out, and of course, the press were on them. Why, Mr. Maraniss, Joe Jones said this. You'll never agree to that, would you? Well, no, I'd never agree to that. And then they'd go to Joe Jones. Well, Mr. Jones, Mr. Maraniss said this. You'd never agree to that. So it exacerbated the problem. At one point, the party leaders came to me and said, it won't work. We got to escape. We need private, secret negotiations. And I arranged for us to go to London to the U.S. Ambassador's office, where we had about a week of peace and quiet and kind of advance the process away. But it's hard. It's very, very difficult. And I used to have press conferences almost every day to sum up the talks, and I had to try to balance between giving an accurate description of what occurred, but not gloom and doom, so that people would interpret it as over and non-productive. It's a very, very hard task, very hard task. And I have to say this, I know you're a reporter, and I'm very mindful and respectful of the press.
Let her rip.
I thought the press here was absolutely terrible in terms of accuracy and consistency and checking things out before the American press.
Okay.
I didn't mean Nashville. I meant the American press.
No,
yeah, the American press. Until I got to the UK and Northern Ireland, holy moly, it makes the American press look like paragons of virtue and accuracy and truth. And then I went from there to the Middle East. Oh, wow, it was a steep ladder down in terms of accuracy and people printing things that had nothing to... I can't tell you how many stories I've read about things I allegedly said, which are just complete fiction. So it does make it tough, but you have to meet both obligations. Somehow, through trial and error, you got to figure out a way to give people a reasonably accurate portrait of what is occurring without jeopardizing the prospect for success of the negotiation, which requires some degree of confidentiality. Ehud Barak has said to me often, if Israelis and Palestinians could sit down, you ask him about this, could sit down and no discussion in public, the first discussion would be announcing an agreement, it'd be easy to get an agreement because they could then, both sides could justify it as having gotten something, and you don't run the risk of being exposed on a particularly difficult issue on your side. But that can't happen, so you got to do the best you can to try to balance the two. Ultimately, we did it in Northern Ireland, but it was awfully difficult.
I don't know if you've seen the documentary, The Gatekeepers.
No, I've not.
But it's a very powerful and disturbing account that's centered around the last 6 chiefs of the Shin Bet, the Israeli Security Service. And they all have very different perspectives or sort of ways of going about their business. And yet all 6 of them, from 1980 through 2010, in this documentary, come to the conclusion that the two-state solution is the only solution, and that a conversation with the Palestinians is mandatory, not just something that maybe should happen, but has to happen, and that it's the politicians that they're having trouble getting past it. The security service is ready for it. It says that even from the Israeli perspective, having a conversation with Hamas, the most militant aspect of what they have to deal with, is just as important, is more important than not conversing with them, and it has to happen.
Well, I agree with that position. I will say it's different when you're an elected politician and you have to face the electorate than if you're an appointed official. You're not the same pressures and circumstances. But let me give you reasons why I think it's in Israel's interest, and I conveyed this to the Prime Minister, and then let me take a moment with the Palestinians. Israel now is overwhelmingly dominant militarily, and they cannot be militarily dislodged. They have an absolutely firm, unshakable American commitment to their security, and they are in a strong position. What they don't have is security for their people. There remains a high level of fear and anxiety because of these rockets. Now, if they don't get a two-state solution, they will very soon face a choice that Ehud Barak has said many times they should not be forced to make, and that's demographics. At this moment, there are just a little more than 5.75 million Jews living in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. There are just a little more than 5.25 million Arabs, counting Israeli Arabs, Palestinians in the West Bank, and Gaza. Except for a very small but rapidly growing portion of the Israeli public, the ultra-conservatives, who are growing fast, their population is relatively stagnant, and there are no longer any major sources of migration that they can look for. The Arab population is growing much more rapidly. In a very few years, and I mean 2 or 3 years, the lines on the graph will cross. And so Israel at that point, if the two-state solution is lost, will have to choose between being a democratic state or a Jewish state. It will not be able to be both. And that will be a critical moment in the history of Israel when they make that decision. And whichever way they go, it's going to have awful consequences. The second factor is...
Why would it be awful consequences if they choose democratic state?
If they choose a democratic state?
Yeah.
Because they will lose the Jewish tradition and they will have internal upheaval in Israel, because that is a critical factor for very substantial portions of their population. It might be okay for the United States, be very good for the Palestinians. It will create tremendous internal stress within Israel. It's a factor that cannot be overlooked. Second is technology. All military men fight the last wars. And what we recall of the past century is tanks, armies marching across borders, aircraft. The threat to Israel isn't from an Arab army crossing the border. That can't happen. It isn't suicide bombers. That's not happening. It's rockets. Hamas has 8,000, crude, ineffective, limited range, but they're improving both numbers and quality all the time. Hezbollah on the northern border has between 30 and 50,000. Better. One of the beneficial byproducts of the upheaval in Syria has been the disruption of an upgrade program that Hezbollah was engaged in from Iran through Syria. But you could have 30,000 rockets fired at Israel from the border, not from a distance, right on the border, from where I'm sitting to where Jim Sasser's sitting. And the third is isolation. Israel's strength is growing in the United States, and particularly in the House of Representatives, but it is declining everywhere else in the world. I spent a third of my time as U.S. envoy in Europe, in Asia, trying to shore up support for our position. And it's declining all the time, and that's a matter of very serious consequence, particularly when you view the prospect of U.S. energy independence, no longer dependent on oil from the Middle East in just a few decades. And you combine that with the fact that while there are now, at this moment, 7 billion people on Earth, 1 out of 5 are Muslim, 1.2 billion. In 2050, 37 years from now, there'll be between 9.5 and 10 billion people on Earth, and 1 out of 3 will be Muslim. 3.5 billion Muslims on Earth, which is equal to the total population of the world in 1965. A far-sighted policy would look to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, getting normalized relations, particularly with the Gulf Arab states, for whom the real enemy is not Israel, it's Iran, and who, I think, recognize that Israel is here to stay. They might not like it, but they're not going anywhere. The United States has made a commitment that it will honor and will not break, and it is their interest to settle into a more normalized region and combat the real threat. Now I'm going on too long, but I want to give a complete answer. Now take a look at the Palestinian side. In 1947, the United Nations proposed a partition of the region between Israel and a Palestinian state. Israel accepted, the Arabs rejected. Now they rejected it because they thought they could defeat Israel. There were only 600,000 Jews there then, and the Arab countries, 6 of them had populations totaling scores of millions. And so 6 countries invaded Israel. And the outcome wasn't certain. But Israel won the first of many wars. They've won every one since. There's not an Arab leader today, and not a reasonable person anywhere, who would not gladly accept now the offer that was spurned in 1948. But that offer is no longer on the table and never again will be, because the circumstances have changed so dramatically on the ground. And since then, they've rejected every offer. And they imposed conditions on negotiating. I said to Arafat many times, as closer than I'm sitting to you, and also to President Abbas, there is not a shred of evidence, not a shred, to suggest that the offers are going to get any better in the future. They've got to do the reasonable, common sense thing is sit down and talk, stay in negotiations with American support and participation on both sides to get a state. It won't be what they want in terms of territory. It won't be what they want in all other respects, but it'll be a state, and they can build on it just as the Israelis have built on it. And this continuing delay dooms them to another 60 years of occupation, in which the constraints on them are worse than ever. And you've seen the figures about settlements in Jerusalem and so forth.
400,000.
The longer you wait, the more difficult it is. So both sides, I think, ought to break through and say, we're going to sit down and we're going to settle this, we're going to make the best deal possible because it is in our interest to do so, not as a favor to the other side, but because it's in their interest. Risky for some? Yes. Less risky than not doing it.
Did you see any possible reasonable rationalization for the existence of 400,000 people in the settlements on the West Bank? And why won't the Israelis, I'll of course ask this to Barak, but why won't they recede from there? And what would that do if they did?
Well, for many of them, it's their position that it's their land. And I've had many of them say to me, God gave us that land and no American's going to take it away. And if you believe that, then it's hard to develop a rational argument that rebuts it. There's a profound sense of identity with land, which does go back 5,000 years, 7,000 years back into history. There's absolutely no doubt about that. So that's one factor. The second factor is, which they've expressed many times, they withdrew from Lebanon, they got rockets. They withdrew from Gaza, they got rockets. Now, my answer to that is, in both cases, you withdrew unilaterally. You didn't devise an agreement that enabled a reasonable process to occur on the other side, so you got inevitably what you got because of the nature and mechanics of the withdrawal. If you have a peace agreement, that you can then set up a mechanism to prevent that from occurring. You can make an argument both ways. Look, everybody's got a rational argument from their perspective. The question ultimately comes down to what's best for their people in the long run. That really ought to be the dominating question. Not what's the best political argument, not what's the best legal or religious argument. It's what's best for the society as a whole. But it's very hard. You write about politics. To say to a politician, look, you do this, yeah, you'll probably get beat, you might be assassinated, but 20 years from now, things will be better. Seriously, in Northern Ireland, the two major parties were swallowed up by the results. The two guys who won the Nobel Peace Prize, their parties are out of office. The people who opposed the agreement have taken over. Life is unfair. And it just happens, so it sounds comical, but it isn't. It's a very serious thing. Lives depend upon it.
Sure, Rabin was assassinated.
Rabin was assassinated. So, and families. So it isn't easy. But the answer is it can be done. And with courage and strong leadership and strong support from the United States. Believe me, I do not buy the argument that so many say that the United States is disqualified from being a broker in the Middle East because we so strongly support Israel. We support a Palestinian state. We don't think they're incompatible. In fact, we think it's best for both societies. So I don't find the arguments mutually conflicting. The Arabs have a solution to everything. Cut off aid to Israel and force them to do what you want. The Israelis have a solution for everything. Cut off aid to the Palestinians and force them to do what you want. Both of them. If I say to them when they tell me that, well, how about if we cut off aid to you? Oh, no, you can't do that. The fact is, I don't think that would work on either side. It produces a wrong result. You've got to work with them to persuade them it's in their self-interest. I think it will happen.
Let's back away from the Middle East and even Northern Ireland for a second so that the students in the audience can get to know how you got to this place. They might not know that your father was orphaned. He was Irish, adopted by a Lebanese father, and your mother was a Lebanese immigrant. Who could not read or write?
That's right. Well, let me tell, if I can tell a story about that. We've been talking about other places. Let me talk about this country for a while. Before I entered the Senate, I had the great honor of serving as a federal judge. And I loved it because, in part, because every order I ever issued as a federal judge was carried out. As Jim Sasser will tell you, every order I issued as majority leader was either ignored or laughed at. I had no power other than to beg senators to do what they should have done without being asked. And in these peace talks, I had no power. But what I most enjoyed was when I presided over naturalization ceremonies, their citizenship ceremonies. A group of people who'd come from every part of the world gathered before me in a federal courtroom in Maine. And there I administered to them the oath of allegiance to the United States. And by the power vested in me under our Constitution, I made them Americans. It was highly emotional for me because, as David has said, my mother was an immigrant. She had no education, couldn't read or write, and she spent her entire life working a night shift in a textile mill. My father was the orphan son of Irish immigrants. He never knew his parents. He was raised in an orphanage. And after several years, he was adopted by an elderly couple who themselves had emigrated from Lebanon. My father left school after the third grade, and he was a janitor at a local college. We've got a very nice small college in my hometown, Colby College. My father was a janitor there. Because of their efforts, because I got so many helping hands along the way, I was able to get an education to become the majority leader of the United States Senate. And to me, that's what our country is about. After every one of these ceremonies, I made it a point to speak personally with each new citizen, individually or in family groups, and I asked them where they came from, how they came. The stories were different, but all fascinating. And there were common themes, and they were best summarized by a young Asian man who, when I asked why he came, replied in very slow and broken English, "I came, Judge," he said, "because in America, everybody has a chance." Now think about the fact that a young man who'd been an American for 10 minutes, who spoke very halting English, was able to sum up the meaning of our country in a single sentence. America is freedom and opportunity. That's what's made this country so great. And I've been so lucky and so fortunate in my life to have so many opportunities available to me, most of them by chance and by people giving me a helping hand, that I think that's what's most important about our country. And incidentally, we're in danger of losing that now. We are losing upward mobility. I think because, for a number of reasons, one of which is the disparity in income in our society has grown dramatically. Also, because we have had successive waves of immigration in our society. There was difficulty in absorbing all of them. Some of the Irish here will remember the profound discrimination against Irish, but most at least were Northern European. When we moved to Southern European and Eastern Russia, it became more difficult. Now we're moving to Latin America and Asia. It's becoming even more difficult because the differences are more obvious. I think what we need, I don't want to get into another subject now, but in my mind, the whole immigration debate is focused on the wrong issue. The issue ought to be, how can we attract talented, able, aspiring people to come to this country? Steve Jobs' father was born in Syria. Would we be a better country if his father couldn't get into the United States? I just read an interesting article a couple of months ago in a magazine about a new advanced form of what's called facial replacement surgery. Started with military people losing parts of their faces in conflict and has now spread to others. The preeminent physician in the world is a guy in Boston who was born in Slovakia, came here 20 years ago to go to school and ended up staying. Everybody here knows examples of that. We're focused on the wrong thing. We ought to be focused on replenishing the skill, the entrepreneurship, the innovation, the drive, the energy from which we've derived so much as a country. And so, to me, when I speak publicly, I try to focus people on that, and I would wish our debate nationally would emphasize that more than what the subject is being emphasized now.
Turning to American politics, before we get to your experiences in the Senate and so on, today in my class you were talking about Citizens United, the major Supreme Court decision on campaign funding, and compared it to, you said it was the Dred Scott decision of the 21st century. Pretty strong words, but...
Democracy means the rule of the people. Literally, it's a combination of two Greek words. Demos, the people, kratzi, the rule of. To function effectively, there has to be a bond of some trust between the people and the elected officials. That bond has been largely severed in our country. I'll ask this question here, which I ask. I got a series of questions all over the country. How many people here believe that elected representatives in Washington are more responsive to their constituents than they are to their contributors? Not one hand, and I haven't got a hand yet raised anywhere in America. Because everybody knows that it's a mad money chase, and it is consuming our legislators and is destroying the bond of trust between them. Now I'm going to read you two other sentences regarding elections. Independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or to the appearance of corruption. Does anybody here believe that? A second sentence. The appearance of influence or access, furthermore, will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. Anybody here believe that? Those are direct quotations from the Citizens United case and the premises upon which the case is based. A system already awash in money, much of it illegal, much of it corrupting. Not corrupting in the sense that, Senator Mitchell, if you cast a vote this way, I'll pay you $100,000 cash in a suitcase, but corrupting in the sense of severing the bond of trust between the people and their elected officials. The Supreme Court now has said, let's pour billions more into it. And I think it makes it far more difficult to rein in the process and to restore some degree, some minimal degree of cooperation, comity, institutions, loyalty to the institutions and to the public. Shouldn't the principal question be, indeed shouldn't the only question be, what's best for the country? Not for my party, not for my ideology, not for my career. And yet that's been pushed to the side. And I think it's very, very unfortunate.
My handler is saying one more question before we go to the audience. So okay. I hope that the audience can ask some questions about politics, and we'll leave that for that. But I couldn't have you on the stage without asking you about baseball.
Okay.
Because I love it as much as you do. Yes. You've seen the best and worst of sports in a sense. You've seen the Red Sox win a World Series.
Two.
One was enough. Now you're spoiled. But you also, as the head of what became known as the Mitchell Report and Commission, you saw athletes doing whatever they could to advance their careers at the expense of their health and of the law. What did you learn from that experience in terms of the balance between sort of the win-at-all-costs philosophy and the value of sports in our society?
Well, I learned to be humble about the whole process, about my ability to predict or see things. I learned also that people act out of self-interest. If you're a young man born in this country or in another, facing desperate poverty and a life of little prospect and unlikely employment, and you got a chance to make $5 million a year, it's hard to make moral or legal arguments about what you should or shouldn't do. The incentives are very powerful. There's also an incentive for those engaged in the existing illicit industry, which right at this moment is at work in our country, in parts of Central and Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in China, of those who can make a lot of money developing drugs that enhance performance without detection by current means. And so there's kind of a constant arms race. A lot of money goes into research to detect steroids, and when that succeeds, athletes shift to human growth hormone. And then a lot of money goes into testing to detect that, and by the time that's done, someone else has developed a new one, and the financial benefit is enormous if you can find a drug, if you can create a drug, or if you can allege that you have a drug. Sometimes that's good enough because the incentive the other way is so great. I do think that the Commissioner of Baseball deserves some credit. He's the only commissioner in the only professional sport in this country who's authorized a fully independent report, investigation and report on the use of performance-enhancing substances in that sport. And when the commissioner called me and asked me if I would do this, I said, I got to tell you, before we even get into the conversation, if I do this, I got to be completely independent. I got to call them the way I see them. I can't have any interference or any suggestions or anything. He said, I promise you full independence, and he kept his promise, and I was fully independent. So it was a difficult circumstance. Now, here's an interesting commentary in American life. I've had 3 reports that have become known as the Mitchell Report, one in Northern Ireland, one in the Middle East, and one on baseball. Now, the one in the Middle East, I think we printed 1,000 copies, and most of them are sitting on the shelves in the State Department. We probably 20 of them got distributed. When I did this baseball report, when I stood up to announce my findings at a press conference, by prearrangement, ESPN and Major League Baseball posted it on their website. And the next day, a guy from Major League Baseball called me. He said several million copies were downloaded yesterday. So there's a lot more interest in that. If anybody wants a free copy of my Middle East and Northern Ireland reports, I'll get them to you. But they're out of print and not available. I mean, not of interest to anybody more. But baseball does hold a great hold, and I am a great baseball fan. I'm a sports fan generally.
People want to start lining up for questions. I'll ask one more as they're doing that. It's unpublished, but we're looking forward to quotations from Senator Mitchell, sort of the little blue book of Senator Mitchell. And what's the first quotation or rule of that?
We were talking earlier with students this afternoon, and I told them that while I was in the Senate, Mao Zedong, the Chinese dictator, published a book, a little red cover, small volume called The Sayings of Chairman Mao. And as I got more and more involved in American politics, I was contemplating publishing the sayings of Senator Mitchell in a little blue book. And I thought about it. I didn't tell you this part of the story. I read a biography of Harry Truman. And I don't know if this is true or not, but it's alleged that when Truman went to the Senate, he did not graduate from college, so he had somewhat of an inferiority complex. And he sat at his desk the first day, and he wrote to his wife, "Dear Bess, I'm sitting here in the Senate looking around at these other men and wondering what I'm doing here." And then a couple of years later, he sat down in the Senate, and he wrote to his wife, he said, "Dear Bess, I'm sitting here in the Senate, I'm looking around at these other men, and I wonder what they're doing here." And I grew up a young boy from a very poor family in a small town in Maine, of course, in total awe of the presidency. Total awe. Never once dreaming that I would get to meet, work with, get to know several presidents. And when I did, the most overwhelming impression I had was they're ordinary guys just like us. Same failings, same weaknesses, same everything. And yet, they have a hard time staying informed because they are president, and many people are in awe of them. So saying number one, page 1 in the sayings of Senator Mitchell is, the higher one goes in life, the greater the capacity for self-delusion. And that's not just true in our system. One of the most remarkable stories of the tragedy that Iraq has become was the extent to which Saddam Hussein was living a life of delusion in the months leading up to the war that led ultimately to his removal and death. Literally, the guy was in complete delusion about what was going on and so forth because people were afraid of him. If you said the wrong word, you could be shot. And here, there is a tendency to place the presidency on a sort of a pedestal that I think it can be arguably anti-democratic, not rooted in ordinary life because of the security requirements primarily. And yet, I think presidents have to work hard to get contrary information, to get genuinely honest advice, to get people who will stand up and disagree with them, especially when they insist that they're right. It's a tough thing, but it's essential. It's essential in any position, public or private. But of course, because of the awesome power that a president has, I think it's more essential than ever.
It's an accurate and illuminating saying, but it doesn't seem to apply to its own author, who's not self-delusional. So thank you. Start on the left up there.
Thank you so much for being here. In your remarks on Northern Ireland and Israel, you talked about sides having entrenched points of view, revisionist history, and the need for painful compromise. And I couldn't help but think about our own political situation, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we might move away from kind of a confrontational political discourse and more towards compromise.
It's very difficult, and I don't have a complete or magic solution to it. I think you have to establish the context first, that politics in our country has always been rough. Going back, there was a professor at a university in Maine wrote an op-ed piece in the newspaper which described the election campaign of 1800, in which a supporter of Jefferson called the incumbent president, John Adams, a hermaphrodite, saying of him that he had neither the firmness of a man nor the gentleness of a woman. And a supporter of Adams responded that if Jefferson were elected, murder, rape, robbery, and arson would be taught and practiced all over the country. Well, we had a rough campaign, but nobody called either Romney or Obama a hermaphrodite. And it's always been tough. But, of course, what's happened now is the immense power and ubiquitous nature of electronic media brings it home with an immediacy and a degree of repetition and emotion that drives home differences to an extent that never before existed, all fueled by these fantastic sums of money that are raised and spent in these political campaigns. And of course, when the public is exposed to relentlessly negative comments, he says she's a crook and she says he's a bum, and so why should the public be expected to believe anything other than that one's a crook and one's a bum? So it's very difficult for anyone to elevate the discourse because the public, like individuals, is capable of holding and advocating contrary views at the same time. We hate negative television advertising, yet the research is absolute. People are moved by it. And on many other issues, everybody wants to cut spending until you want to cut something that affects them. So it can be difficult. I do think that the combination of money, negative advertising on television, and the increased degree of gerrymandering is producing a major turning point in American political history, in that the election for the House of Representatives is now decided not in the general election, but in the primaries. A political expert, Jim Sasson knows him, Charlie Cook, he follows politics in Washington, wrote after the last election that only 45 seats in the House of Representatives were genuinely contested. So you now got very safe seats on each side, and a consequence, the members in seeking re-election aren't worried about the general election. They're worried about getting past the primary, which of course gives a hugely disproportionate weight to the most active, who tend to be the most ideological and most rigid members of their party. And it's a vicious downward cycle, I think, that doesn't bode well for society. I think it won't change until the public demands a change, and it's clear that people aren't fed up enough about it yet to make that change. One thing that can be done, I think, is to try to establish better personal relations. Well, the day I was elected Senate Majority Leader, I called Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader in the Senate, and I went to see him. And I said to him, I said, well, you've been here 25 years. I've only been here a couple of years, so you know this place a lot better than me. And I said, but I don't think it can work unless we trust each other. So I said to him, I've come here to tell you how I intend to behave toward you and to ask that you behave in return the same way toward me. And I set out really simple, basic stuff. I said, I won't ever surprise you. I'm not going to criticize you personally. I won't try to embarrass you. I'll try to stick to the issues. He was delighted. We shook hands, and to this moment, a harsh word has never passed between us, in public or in private. You can debate issues, as we did very vigorously, without getting into name-calling. It seems to happen less and less now. My hope is it'll change, but I confess to you that other than somehow reducing the amount of money in politics, I don't have an answer, a full answer to the question.
But it's a great question. On the right?
Thank you. Yeah, my question actually was similar, so I'll just piggyback and let you briefly talk on it since we didn't get to your Senate career much during this talk.
Yeah.
But you know, the Senate, this great deliberative body, is what we're told that it is, but yet the quorum call seems to be the most popular thing that ever happens, at least for us C-SPAN watchers. So my question for you is, what do you miss most from your time when you were there? Now looking at the Senate from your current vantage point, where do you see the future going, knowing some of the current members? And what hope, if any, is there? Thank you.
What I miss most are two things. First, the genuine satisfaction that is unmatched in any other area of life that I've been engaged in with doing something good and meaningful, that you hope and pray benefits our country and the people of our country for generations to come. There's simply nothing in my life other than and I think it fits in the same category, the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, that comes close to matching that. That is, I think, the great satisfaction of public service for anyone. The second thing is the personal relationships. Jim Sasser here was a very dear friend of mine. I saw him almost every day for 15 years, and I don't see him much now. And you build up close bonds of trust, respect, affection with people on both sides. Howard Baker, I was in Knoxville just recently to speak at a function for Howard Baker. Howard was a terrific guy and a good friend, and he, Bob Dole, Tom Daschle, and I created a bipartisan policy center in Washington to deal with the issue that the previous question asked about. So I miss that. What hope I have is, this is more than a hope. For me, this is a conviction. I strenuously disagree with those who now say, write, publish books about the decline of America and the rise of China. I think they fundamentally misread the situation over the next half century. I got married late in life. I had kids late in life. I've got 2 teenage kids, and I tell them they're going to live in much better times than I ever lived in. And I think that's true. I think that this country has overcome many obstacles more serious than the ones we face now. Not to minimize the problems that we have now. But if you look objectively at American history, you've had many crises that, in relative terms, were far more serious than what we have today. And with I think, the same kind of energy and resolve and getting over things. The most remarkable thing to me one of the most remarkable things about American democracy is the capacity and willingness to look reality in the eye, to confess error, and to make changes to do better in the future. And I think we're still capable of that, and I think we will be.
Thank you for asking that question. Next on the left.
Senator, I'd like to kind of go talk about the Middle East again. You said that other than the U.S., most of the world's opinion of Israel has kind of continued to decline. I was hoping you could touch upon why that's the case and how would Israel go about improving upon that?
Yeah. Well, in part, it's the case of reality. There there are very few, relatively speaking, Muslims in the United States, and there are fairly large and increasing proportions of populations of the European countries. So if you believe in democracy, you believe in being responsive to your constituents. But conversely, there's a very substantial and successful and influential Jewish community in the United States, and relatively smaller in the European and other countries. In the Asian countries, virtually non-existent. So the first principle of democracy is you represent the interests of your various constituencies as best you can. That's clearly a factor in all of this on all sides. There are a number of other factors. The Europeans believe that they are much closer to the scene in the Middle East, and therefore are much more concerned about the spillover effects of a conflict, not just in terms of natural resources, but in terms of people. We have a lot of publicity here about people coming across the southern border. They have tremendous issues there about very large populations coming into their countries illegally, and those numbers would dramatically escalate if a conflict broke out. So they are very, very much concerned about not having a conflict develop. And third, I think it's a historical fact that their position on the issues, generally speaking, this is a generalization now because there are 27 countries in the EU and they don't all see eye to eye, but generally speaking, their position historically has been more sensitive to the Palestinian side than and less proportionally sensitive to the Israeli side as this country has been. So it's a combination of factors. Nothing that should surprise or be unusual given the nature of their populations and the dynamics of the effect. And the final other factor is economic. We are looking at now a growing period of American independence in terms of energy. We imported 60% of oil in 2005, 45% last year, 33% in 2020, less than 10% in 2040. And I argue to my Israeli friends, it's not difficult for an American president now to make these unbreakable commitment statements because we have an economic interest in maintaining stability in the region to assure a constant supply of oil. But project yourself into 2050, when 90 to 95% of that oil goes to China and India, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, and we are energy independent. Will the American people still want to maintain large forces there? Right now, China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, their economies are absolutely dependent on the free access in international waters, particularly the Straits of Hormuz, that guarantee their oil supplies. And they don't pay 1 cent to secure those open waters and that supply. The entire burden is borne by the American taxpayer. We now have, not at the moment, but we historically have 2 aircraft carrier groups in the Middle East. China in total has 1 aircraft carrier. Will American taxpayers support that burden 30 years from now when we're not dependent on that oil, when others are? And will we continue to pay the freight? China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These long-term trends ought to be a matter of real concern. And my argument is, I emphasize this, you can't take Israeli-Palestinian conflict out of context. You've got to keep it in that overall context of the region. There are a lot of intersecting factors and conflicts, not least of which is the Sunni-Shia divide, which is accelerating in intensity and rapidity throughout that region. But it's much better for the people of Israel to have established normalcy within the region and to join with the other Arab states in facing the real threat to their security, which comes from the drive for hegemony by Iran, particularly to gain control of the petroleum resources of the Persian Gulf. And I'll finish this overly long answer by telling you a story. A couple of years ago, when I was in the Middle East, I had dinner with one of the rulers of one of the Middle Eastern countries. And he said to me, Senator, I figured out what happened in Iran. I said, really? What's that? He said, I've got the answer. I said, what is it? He said, the Shah of Iran is still alive, and he has an office in the basement of the White House. Well, I laughed just like you laughed. Ha, ha, ha. I said, what are you talking about? He said, here's how we look at it. For a very long time, Iran had insecure borders on all sides. Fighting, arguing with the Soviets and the Russians over the north. You came in and you knocked off the Soviet Union. Now they have a very secure northern border. They hated the Taliban. Taliban are right-wing Sunnis, the Iranians are Shia. You came in, you knocked off the Taliban. Now they got a secure eastern border. Their mortal enemy was Saddam Hussein. They fought an 8-year war. 1 million people died. You came in, you knocked off Saddam Hussein. Now they got as he put it, a vassal state. I think that's an overstatement, but that's the way he put it in Iran. He said they are completely secure, north, east, and west. Now they can do what they want to do for a long time. They can come after us in our oil. A consequence of American policy. Well, of course, the consequences are indisputable, although the intention was not there. But that's the reality in the region. That's the reality. And to me, it just makes sense, common sense, self-interest, to establish normalcy among those who share that concern. The Israelis certainly do, the Arabs certainly do, and preventing them from doing it, a big factor is the continuing Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Senator Mitchell had told our class half-jokingly that he had the filibustering skills to be able to talk all night. But,
yeah.
And I would listen to you.
Don't put me to the test, though.
No. So we'll take one more question from the right up there.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity here this evening. Though the IAEA has repeatedly said there's no evidence of Iran building a nuclear weapon, hypothetically, what if Iran did go against Ayatollah Khomeini's renunciation of nuclear weapons and pursued the Japanese option of latency, or did develop a weapon? How do you feel this would play out? And what do you think of the potential of mad theory leading to a deterrence of escalations in the region and more normalcy of relations between the nations in the region?
The acoustics aren't as good coming this way as that way. What did he say?
Okay.
Could you understand it?
It was about Iran. There were a couple of things.
It's about Iran, but I couldn't get to. Step just slightly away from the microphone and repeat it, please.
They're saying closer here. Okay. So we continue to hear about Iran's nuclear program in the news. Though the IAEA has repeatedly said that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon, and the Ayatollah Khomeini has renounced nuclear weapons. But hypothetically, if Iran did pursue the Japanese option of latency or built a weapon, how do you feel that would play out in relations in the region? And what do you think of the potential of mad theory leading to a deterrence of escalations and normalizing relations to counter the Israeli nuclear arsenal?
Well, I don't think there's any useful purpose in my or any other public official speculating about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. I think that the president's policy is correct. It's unacceptable for them to have a nuclear weapon, and they're not going to have one. I think speculation of the type that you seek undermines, and to me, isn't something that I think I or anybody else should engage in. I think we should concentrate our efforts on succeeding in what we're doing, in preventing them from getting a weapon, and I think there are some hopeful signs in that respect. Much of the attention on the Iranian program has focused on its relationship with Israel. That's important, but insufficient attention, I think, has been paid to the effect on the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The United States led the world into the nuclear age, and we have led the world in the effort to restrain their dissemination with a considerable degree of success. We have a consistent pattern here of self-flagellation and criticizing ourselves and not recognizing where we've been successful. So today, If you include North Korea, there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. But there are many times 9 who have the capacity to produce nuclear weapons, who have voluntarily refrained from doing so in reliance on American policy and on the policy of non-proliferation. The real danger of Iran getting a weapon is that, in my judgment, and this is an opinion, it will almost certainly trigger a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. I believe that there are already several countries in the region who have begun quietly laying the groundwork to develop programs of their own should that occur. And that could spread easily into Asia. You see right now the tensions between Japan and China you've had for the first time being spoken publicly in Japan. China has them. North Korea has them. We must think about our own future. You're hearing publicly in South Korea about the need to develop nuclear weapons to offset those in the North. That would pose, in my judgment, a risk far greater than what exists now. Because if you had 29 instead of 9, the potential for leakage to non-government entities, the potential for use, there are a lot of people running countries who you wouldn't want running the garage where you get your car fixed. That's a reality. And to have these people with possession of nuclear weapons is a very dangerous thing for us and for stability in the world, which stability is very much in our interest. So in terms of Iran, I think the president's policy is the right one. He has said that we will negotiate, we will act in good faith, we, I believe correctly, do not take at face value their government's protestations that they're not seeking to develop nuclear weapons. The evidence is to the contrary. And we should impose sanctions to hopefully bring about the desired result. Not guaranteed. We should go ahead and do it, and we should maintain a policy that all options are on the table, and our objective is to prevent that from occurring. It's a somber note to end the meeting. So let me close with one story, if I can.
Please. He's a great storyteller.
Yeah, I want to lighten up the atmosphere. And I tell the story in honor of Senator Yasser. I entered the Senate under unusual circumstances. I was a federal judge, and one of Maine's senators, Ed Muskie, was appointed Secretary of State. And so the governor was to appoint someone to complete his term. There was a lot of speculation in the papers. My name was not mentioned because I'd just been appointed a federal judge a year before. Former governor, former senator. So the governor said he's going to hold a press conference on a Monday noon at the state capitol. So that Sunday night, I went to bed early. Most of us in Maine go to bed early. And wondering what the governor was going to do the next day. About 11 o'clock that night, the phone rang. There's the governor on the phone. He said, I want you to come down to State House tomorrow. I want to announce that I'm going to appoint you to the Senate. I said, gee, Governor, this is a big decision. I need time to think about it. I got to talk to my family. He said, I'll give you 1 hour. I protested that it was inadequate. He said, that's it. You got to tell me in an hour. So I immediately called my 3 older brothers. I grew up in a small town in Maine, as I said. I had 3 older brothers, very famous athletes, very well known throughout our state, New England basketball players. I came along, and I was not as good an athlete as my brothers. In fact, I was not as good as anybody else's brother. And so at a very early age in life, I became known as Johnny Mitchell's kid brother, the one who isn't any good. As you might expect, I developed an inferiority complex and a highly competitive attitude toward my brothers, which persists to this day. So on that night after I hung up from the governor, I called my 3 brothers, got them all on the line, and I confess that while I was ostensibly seeking their advice, there was a note of triumphalism in my voice. I said, the governor wants to appoint me to the Senate, the U.S. Senate. Did you hear that? The U.S. Senate. What do you guys think about that? The responses were very negative. My brother Johnny said, everybody knows you're a born loser. He said, you couldn't possibly win an election. He said, in fact, we can't understand how you got to be a federal judge. He said, so you better stay where you are. My older brother, he thinks of himself as an intellectual. He practices the method. It was a Socratic method of action. He said, let's look at this from the standpoint of the people of Maine. Aren't they entitled to have a qualified person representing them in the Senate? And isn't it obvious that you're not one of them? So I hung up. I called the governor. I said, Governor, I don't need an hour. I've already received all the reassurance I need of my ability to serve in this position. So I went down to Washington, and I was scheduled to be sworn in on Tuesday, but the plane landed late Monday afternoon, and on a whim, literally on a whim, I said to the cab driver, I got nothing to do tonight, so take me up to the Senate. And I went to the Senate, and I had a clerk take me in. The Senate was in session, debating a bill. And Senator Byrd was then the majority leader, and the clerk brought me up and introduced me to him. He had only a vague idea who I was, and he mentioned something about swearing in, so Senator Byrd said, okay, I'll swear you in right now. He mistakenly thought I was there to be sworn. I protested. No. I said, we got a big ceremony tomorrow. I said, the Washington Post is going to cover it tomorrow, the New York Times, I'm sure CBS and NBC will want to reserve time for tomorrow. I said, oh, look, young man. He said, we're very busy here. He said, we'll swear you in right now. So he interrupted the Senate debate. It lasted less than 10 seconds. Jim Sasser was standing about 10 feet away. He didn't even know anybody was being sworn in. It was one of the disillusionments of my life, because when you get appointed a federal judge, it's a big ceremony. It's a big deal. This was nothing. So then the Senate resumed debate, and almost immediately a vote occurred. For those of you interested in political trivia, I hold the all-time record in American history for having cast a vote the shortest time after becoming a senator. 2 minutes. That was the first of many informed judgments I made in your behalf. And on behalf of other Americans. Now, so after the vote, these other guys go over to the business. I don't know what to do. I'm standing there. I'm now a senator. Pretty soon this young guy comes running in, introduces himself to me. He's my administrative assistant. I never met him, never heard of him. He had been Senator Muskie's, and now he was mine. And he proceeded to give me a hard time, berated me for permitting myself to be sworn in a day ahead of schedule. And then he went over this long list of things that I had to do that night. And he said, we got a great invitation. Here he said, there's 3,000 certified public accounts meeting in a convention here in Washington. They saw you being sworn in on TV, and they called and asked if you'd come and deliver the keynote address to them tonight. I said, really? I said, I always knew accountants were very smart, and they are. Every accountant I've met is a really smart guy. But how these guys figured out I was going to be here when I myself didn't know until just a day or so ago. It's not that, he said. They've had 4 last-minute cancellations. He said, you're the only member of Congress they could think of who might not have anything to do tonight. I said, what do they want me to talk about? He said, the tax code. I said, the tax code? You got 3,000 people there. Every one of them knows more about the subject than I do. How can I go do that? And this guy stood himself up and a voice dripping with condescension. He said, listen, he said, you're now a United States Senator. You will regularly be called upon to speak on subjects you know nothing about. He said, so get down there and talk to them tonight. And so I went down, and here I am to tell you guys what's going on in the world tonight. Thank you all very much.